So I guess I'll kick things off then. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the second panel of this term by the Platypus Affiliated Society at OSU. So Platypus is a registered student organization here at Oregon State, which joins over 50 campus chapters across the United States, Europe, Asia, and Oceania. The club, for all our activities, we host panels like this one, a weekly meetup on Mondays at 5 p.m. at Java 2 at the Valley Library, so the downstairs little cafe, and a weekly reading group on the history of the left. And for that, we'll have our last reading group session of the term this next Monday at 7 p.m., finishing off our fourth week on the writings of Karl Marx, and then we're going to be restarting it again next January. So if you're interested in any of those activities, you can add your name. I believe we have a sign-up sheet back there, or you can just show up at any of these events, I also want to point out that we have a free monthly broadsheet featuring widely divergent perspectives on the left, the Platypus Review, of which there's a ton of copies back there on that table. And it's available around campus, generally wherever we find out we can leave copies, you'll see them somewhere. The forthcoming issue features a book review from one of our panelists today, Bill Smaldone, on a recently published volume of Marxist theorist Edward Bernstein on the German Revolution. And with that, I'll turn things over to our moderator, who is Adoni Melandopoulos, who is the advisor of the student club and just member of Platypus. So,
great. Thanks, Lance. Okay. To begin with, I just wanted to introduce our panelists. I think it's a really remarkable panel to have here with us today. To begin with, Joe Beinin is Donald J. McLachlan Professor of History and Professor of Middle East History. I said you're okay. Emeritus at Stanford University, where he taught from 1983 to 2019. His research and teaching have focused on the history and political economy of modern Egypt, Palestine, and Israel, and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He's lived for extended periods in Israel-Palestine and in Egypt, including 2 years as the Director of Middle East Studies at the American University in Cairo. In 2002, he served as President of the Middle Eastern Studies Association of North America. And I'm going to try and say it the way that you told me earlier. Mahdy Alkhodr. I don't have the in my lexicon. Is a nuclear engineering student here at Oregon State University. He's been a Marxist-Leninist for more than a year and was interested in left politics from before that. He has strong opinions on the ongoing crisis in Palestine, currently from both the perspective as a leftist and a Muslim. And Bill Smaldone is the professor of history at Willamette University. He's written extensively on the history of Central European social democracy and on European socialism more generally. He's a lifelong socialist, a member of Solidarity, and served on the Salem City Council from 1999 to 2002. The guidelines for the panel are that panelists have a maximum of 15 minutes for their initial remarks. I've let them know that they'll have to wrap things up when the timer goes off, but hope they'll be able to expand on their thoughts during the Q&A period. After that, they'll be given an opportunity to respond to one another for 3 minutes. We've asked them to use this time to help clarify differences and similarities amongst their remarks, and we hope this will set the stage for a lively and respectful and focused Q&A with you. I'll wind things down at 5:45 and allow the panelists to make some concluding remarks. And I think there is some plan to go and grab a bite to eat after this. So if you're interested, hang around and follow the crowd of people. Let me read the prompt they were given. How should the left understand the present crisis in the Middle East, its origins and its historical meaning? What role has the left had in shaping these conditions, whether positively or negatively? Is there a left-wing alternative to the present escalation of bloodshed? If yes, what? If not, why not? What are the goals of the left in the broader Middle East? How do these relate to the tasks facing the left here? Which way forward for Palestinian liberation? Joel, if you could start off.
Two peoples now live and will continue to live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Neither is going anywhere. One of those people, the Israeli Jewish people, was largely implanted in the territory as a consequence of the Zionist settler colonial project. Nonetheless, they have become a national community. Unlike the white settlers of North America, Australia, and New Zealand, the Zionist settlers did not commit a genocide against the indigenous Palestinian people in the early stages of their settlement project, although Israeli leaders have openly announced their desire to do so in the Gaza Strip since October 7th. Between the river and the sea today, there are roughly equal numbers of Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, about 7 million each. There is no Algerian solution to this situation. Israeli Jews will not be returning to their homeland because they have no other. Because the populations are roughly equal, are substantially segregated, and with some important exceptions do not share a language, a religion, culture, historical experience, or, except for the Communist Party of Israel, about which a little bit more later, a common political framework, there is no South African solution to this situation. This does not dictate any specific future constitutional arrangement. One state, 2 states, 2.5 states. It means that we should not expect that there will cease to be 2 distinct national communities with demands for cultural expression and political self-determination. There is no military solution to this existential situation. Palestine will not be liberated by armed struggle of the Palestinian Arabs. Hamas does not offer a horizon for liberating anyone. Its attack on Israel was an astonishing assertion of Palestinian initiative that challenged many myths that Israel and its supporters cherished and revealed many Israeli weaknesses. Some, claiming to be on the left, hailed and uncritically celebrated this exercise of Palestinian agency. This is a serious error. Hamas's inhumane and criminal October 7th attack on Israel, despite its accomplishment of fighting on the soil of Palestine, Israel for the first time since 1948, and successfully engaging Israeli military forces, posed no fundamental threat to the state of Israel and set back Palestinian liberation by associating the cause of Palestine with indefensible atrocities against civilians, rape, taking women and children hostages, and so on. Hamas is a reactionary, misogynist, anti-LGBTQ organization allied to the reactionary, misogynist, anti-LGBTQ Iranian regime. The Iranian women and men of the Women Life Freedom movement that erupted in response to the regime's murder of Mahsa Amini a little over a year ago might teach us something about the dangers of a jihad against Israeli occupation. The historic perspective of the Marxist-Leninist left on this conflict was articulated by the Communist International when it admitted the Palestine Communist Party in 1923. They had 3 basic propositions. 1, Zionism is a movement of the Jewish bourgeoisie. 2, it is a movement aligned with British imperialism. 3, it can and should be defeated by the joint struggle of Palestinian, Arab, and Jewish workers in Palestine, with some role for the Palestinian peasantry. The first of these propositions was simply factually wrong. The Zionist movement and the State of Israel until 1977 were led by the Social Democratic Mapai Party, the forerunner of today's Israeli Labor Party, whose main base was the Jewish working class. The labor Zionist settlement movement pursued exclusionary policies against Arab workers. Only its far left elements sought unity with or expressed solidarity with them. The second proposition about the Zionist alliance with British imperialism was absolutely correct until the promulgation of the 1939 British White Paper that restricted Zionist immigration to Palestine. After the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the alliance with British imperialism was replaced by an alliance with France, and then after the 1967 war, an alliance with the United States. The third proposition has been historically falsified. The left remained weak in Palestine, It could not unite Jewish and Arab workers in significant numbers. And despite the important growth of a left-wing Palestinian Arab intelligentsia and labor movement in the 1940s, great majorities of both populations remained loyal to their national movements. In some sense, then, the situation that we face today is a result of the historic failure of the left. Because of this situation, the Soviet Union reluctantly accepted the proposition that a Jewish national community had been formed in Palestine by the late 1940s. In Leninist theory, this meant that it had the right to self-determination. Therefore, the Soviet Union reluctantly endorsed the November 1947 UN partition plan to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. The United States also accepted the partition plan. Both the Soviet Union and the United States were in some large measure motivated by the desire to weaken British imperialism in the Middle East. They were mostly unaware of and unconcerned with the roughly 800,000 Jews who lived in the Middle East and North Africa outside of Palestine. They and their descendants now comprise about half of all the Jews living in Israel. Their communities have always been subjected to discrimination by the largely European, that is Ashkenazi-led Zionist movement, although that is no longer a straightforward matter, since many of them form the social base of the Israeli right today. The State of Israel would not have come into existence without the military support it received from the Soviet bloc, particularly Czechoslovakia. The Western imperial powers contributed nothing to the Israeli war effort in 1948, and the United States tried to block the implementation of the UN partition plan in the spring of 1948 because of its oil interests in Saudi Arabia and the other Arab oil-rich countries. Neither the Soviet Union nor the United States paid much attention to the Palestinian Nakba, that is, the catastrophe, the destruction of Palestinian society, and the expulsion or flight in fear of some 750,000 Palestinians during the 1948 war that consolidated the establishment of the State of Israel. The international communist movement, including several Arab communist parties, although there were splits over the issue, supported the establishment of the State of Israel and supported Israel until it broke with the Soviet bloc by supporting the United States in the Korean War in 1950. Trotskyists were the main body of Marxists who rejected the UN partition plan and who persisted in calling for Arab and Jewish workers to unite in a struggle against Zionism and British imperialism, subsequently also French and American imperialism. They have historically been very few in number, although there are three outstanding individuals who it's worth mentioning and whose works are worth reading whether you consider yourself a Trotskyist or not. I do not. One is Yigal Gluckstein, whose pen name is Tony Cliff, and he became the leading figure in the British Socialist Workers' Party. Another is Gilbert Achcar, who led the Trotskyist movement in Lebanon for many years and then emigrated to France and ultimately to the United Kingdom, where he now teaches at the School of Oriental and African Studies of London University. And the third is French-Israeli, French-born, moved to Israel in 1966, I think. Mikhail Warshawski, whose nom de guerre is Mikado. Social Democrats were not uniformly enthusiastic about Zionism before World War II. After World War II, they mostly embraced Zionism, and Mapai, what's today the Labor Party, which barely actually exists, but it's there, became a member of the Second International. In the 1960s, the current of pan-Arab nationalism and Arab socialism, led by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Ba'ath Party in Syria and Iraq, newly independent Algeria, and the People's Democratic Republic of South Yemen, gained ascendancy. These regimes were aligned with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, the international communist movement, and almost every other political left political current in the world, and many individuals supported them as the leading anti-imperialist force in the Middle East, North Africa region, an analysis that I personally agree with, despite their many, many, many flaws. There were several problematic consequences to that situation. First, the Communist Party of Israel, which included both Arabs and Jews, all the way going back to its early years as the Communist Party of Palestine in the 1920s, split on largely ethnic lines. There was an all-Jewish faction, which subsequently disappeared, and a mostly Arab faction, which was originally called the New Communist List, that has to do with the Israeli electoral system, and which today has reclaimed the name the Communist Party of Israel and is overwhelmingly Arab, with some Jewish members. A small group, internationally known as Matzpen, which means compass, but its official name is the Israeli Socialist Organization, split from the Communist Party in 1962, advancing this argument of the centrality of the Arab nationalist, Arab socialist regimes as the leading anti-imperialist force in the Middle East, North Africa region. The Egyptian Communist Party split over this, and there were many splits in the Iraqi communist movement, too many to remember. The 1967 Arab-Israeli War, in which Israel defeated Syria and Egypt, most importantly, because they were the leading Arab nationalist, Arab socialist states, but also Jordan, which was an ally of the West, further reformulated the Arab left. You had the rise of an Arab New Left, mostly in Beirut and Cairo, very much part of the global New Left of the late 60s, early 70s. The leading elements in the Arab New Left were Palestinian, so the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, both of which called themselves Marxist-Leninist organizations, although they understood that that meant very differently than each other and than what other Marxist-Leninist organizations understood that to mean. There were also Lebanese, Egyptian, and other Arab New Left organizations. The Arab New Left as a whole, however, was led by an organization that was not in any way, shape, or form left, and that is Fatah, which was the largest faction of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And because the Palestinians led the Arab New Left altogether, Fatah emerged as an important force despite it not being a leftist organization. And its program, a secular democratic state, that is to say, no Israel, a Palestinian Arab state, in which only Jews born before the issuance of the Balfour Declaration of 1917 could remain, became the common platform, the common perspective. The Arab New Left was eventually defeated definitively by the outbreak of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975, by the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and the ascendancy of Islamists throughout the region. And it was only the first Palestinian Intifada of 1987-1991 that again forced a reformulation of what's left and what are leftist solutions to the situation. And basically the Intifada, which was led locally by West Bankers and people in the Gaza Strip, consolidated around the idea of a two-state solution. A Palestinian state in 22% of Mandate Palestine with its capital in East Jerusalem, and an Israeli state in the borders that it had before the 1967 war. That perspective was embraced by not only the PLO, but also the Israeli left, some elements of the left in the Arab world, and the main opponent of it at that time was Hamas, which formed only in 1988. That solution was initially a solution of the Palestinian nationalist movement, supported perhaps most enthusiastically by the Palestine Communist Party, which was substantial in the West Bank at that time. And it led to what became known as the Oslo process, which failed. So here we are with the failure of the Oslo process, no prospect for a two-state solution anywhere on the horizon, and no prospect for a one-state solution either. So that whole discussion is mostly a waste of time. Oh, that's it. I get maybe 30 seconds to finish. The left is weak everywhere in the region, in the Arab world, in Israel. The left is weak globally, so no surprise there. The way forward for the left is what it always was: joint struggle of Arabs and Jews for a future of equality, democracy, self-determination for all in the region between the river and the sea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mahdy, change pins.
You're up next.
And your water.
Oh dear, oh goodness. Thank you.
Oh, we had 3 minutes of discussion.
Oh, 3 minutes after
Oh.
we'll all go. Sorry about the clarification.
Well, in that case, first I would like to define what I define personally as left politics, and what I will try to refer to as left politics. And in order to understand it, I think we should, in order to understand it, we should first define what is the left-right spectrum, which is often very vague. I personally see the spectrum as the progress in how control over production relationships evolves. To give an example, during the days of feudalism, where production in large part was owned by feudal lords and nobility, capitalism as an emerging force was on the left wing of the spectrum in the fight against feudalism. The members of the aristocracy were the established order, as I'm calling it. The established order are those who already have control of the tools, land, resources necessary to produce goods and services, aka the means of production. The capitalists, whose interests at the time were more in line with what benefited the majority of people, mainly the capitalists, but also aspects of the peasantry, but that's more complicated, wanted themselves to have ownership of the means of production and impose the aristocracy for their own self-interest, which acted tangentially as a progressive force. This established order, or status quo, as now I will refer to it, are those who occupy the right wing of the spectrum, while the left are the progressive forces who oppose the status quo for the sake of advancing ownership of the means of production. The status quo's relationship to production is as an owner class. The relationship of the progressive forces to production are the ones who want to be the next owner class. How should the left understand the present crisis in the Middle East and its origins, its historical reasons? The present crisis, currently, in my opinion, the foundations and purpose of the Israeli state are dependent on two factors: the internal foundations of Israel and the external factors that necessitate its existence in the Middle East. Since my co-panelists can provide a more well-versed opinion on regards to the internal factors, I will mainly discuss my view of the external factors. Through these external factors, though these factors may influence some aspects of Israeli domestic policy, how much I think is to be determined by those more educated than myself. What is more important, in my opinion, is how these external factors influence the role that Israel plays in the wider Middle East. Israel is meant to be, in my opinion, Israel is meant to be a constant destabilizing force in the region in order to make sure that regional players never materialize a somewhat unified political bloc, which would take advantage of their resources and perhaps challenge Western economic interests, whether intentionally or simply through the sake of economic development. It depends. This understanding can lead to, in my opinion, a better understanding of how the left in the West can affect the status of the conflict. I should also, It should also be stated, this part I think is important, that the claim that Zionists or Israel directs or controls U.S. policy decisions is misguided and should be clarified that the relationship between Israel and the U.S. is one of benefit to U.S. corporations solely. Any benefit to Israel is, in my opinion, meant to serve the end of U.S. corporate interests. Confusing this relationship, in my opinion, can lead to a genuine anti-Semitic conspiracies, which Israel often falsely uses to justify its own actions. This does not mean that they don't exist, but will often co-opt these. As I said, what was it called? For the origins of the crisis, for the sake of brevity, I will only refer to the conditions that the Palestinians face, as I feel the ideology of Zionism is better discussed by those more informed. So for example, my co-panelists. Get here. Palestinians, since the establishment of Israel, have faced countless number of atrocities committed against them, including ethnic cleansing, collective punishment, and legal discrimination on the basis of ethnicity and religion. The most infamous occurrence of ethnic cleansing that I know of occurred in 1948, and it was the Nakba, as presented by my co-panelist. I will also say that in regards to collective punishment, since, to my knowledge, 2007, the Gaza Strip has been blockaded, which makes it nearly entirely impossible to leave the Strip or return, except in some extraneous circumstances. Israel will often subject the population of Gaza to bombings, the shutting down of necessities in response to militant actions against Israel performed by Palestinian resistance groups. The West Bank and other parts of Israel where Palestinians do live, there is often legal discrimination, such as larger sentences for similar crimes, restriction of land ownership to mainly Jews, restriction for living in certain areas due to decisions of admission committees, and they're restricted from voting depending on the location, along with quite a few more civil rights violations. Support for an anti-colonial movement. When speaking of supporting independence movements and anti-colonial movements and secessionist movements, it needs to be known which we as leftists should support. In my opinion, first we should determine why the left shouldn't support every liberation movement that it manifests. I think I'm tying this to my initial definition of the left's objective, which was to oppose the status quo for the sake of advancing the ownership of the means of production. In my opinion, this means that the left should not support national liberation movements that would aid the current global superpower, which in the case of today is the United States and its allies, and such. Since they are the prime enforcers of the modern status quo. What this does mean, though, is that the national liberation movements that we on the left should support should be the ones that weaken Western imperialism and American economic dominance. Sorry. What's it called? Oh, and one of the reasonings I give for this is the more dominant Western corporations have in the world, the more resources they will have to access. The more resources they will have access to for them to combat us here domestically, and will further divide the working class and the capitalist class, making our own domestic struggle much more difficult. Nearly all political movements that seek to benefit Western corporate interests, in my opinion, are not an ally to us and should be denounced. What role has the left had in shaping these conditions? I feel as if this is more that my co-panelists are much more capable of explaining this point than I am, and especially in regards to the region itself. I'm not sure how the American left itself has had an impact. I would say very little. But beyond that, I will move on to the third question, or the third question. Is there a left-wing alternative to the present escalation of bloodshed? If yes, what? If not, why not? The alternative, in my opinion, the alternative the left should present should be categorized in what is currently achievable at the current situation and what is a long-term solution, what we should probably to finally put an end on the violence. So a more gradual situation. Currently, I think at present, seeking a ceasefire should be the objective of all members of the left or those who simply want to stop what is occurring currently. I think this political objective is very achievable in the short term with enough political action, organization, and I believe it's widely popular, at least according to data from the Progress poll conducted during October 18th to the 19th. So these numbers might be out of date now, but from my understanding, they probably hold some significance. 66% of all voters, 80% of Democrats, and 56% of Republicans, 57% of independents agree with the statement the U.S. should call for a ceasefire and de-escalation of violence in Gaza. The U.S. should leverage its close diplomatic relationship with Israel to prevent further violence and civilian death. Since this issue is somewhat bipartisan, I think it is important that we focus on this at the very current moment. Now, for a long-term solution, I think our goal should be eventually the establishment of a secular democratic state, not in the sense as my co-panelists said in regards to FETA, a non-leftist organization suggested. And this state needs to, in my opinion, represent all sides equally. And I feel there are some measures that must be taken in order for this to occur. The first is reparations to Palestinians coming from the former Israeli military apparatus. All individuals and organizations who directly profited off of the Palestinian plight. And I think that these reparations should come from the seizing of assets of these organizations and such in order to defang them, I guess you could say, and not cause a divide to still be there. Second is a no-tolerance policy, in my opinion, to Zionist rhetoric in education, economy, or political activity. Third is education reform to allow equal access and quality of education for all. 4, a no-tolerance policy for anti-Semitism or Islamophobia in the subsequent education reforms. 5th is the right to return for expelled Palestinians during the Nakba on land where they hold significant claim to. I do not mean the, for example, singular plots of land that would end up expelling people who have already, made a foundation for their lives here. I mean simply in the area itself, right? A rehabilitation to any people who break with the no tolerance for Zionism, Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism policy. I think a vast education campaign needs to be conducted in that regard. And this one, I'm not sure how popular it may be, but in my opinion, the removal of very recent and militant settlers who currently, who at this point are occupying land whose owners are still alive, still exist, and these people also, and the settlers themselves having a home to go back to. So, very big emphasis on recent and militant on that proposal. In my opinion, without these measures, I think any new state that would occupy the region would be unstable, violent, and unnecessarily repressive. And unless those who hold power, who form the reactionary elements who hold power in Israel and Palestine are not defanged, not taken, power is not taken from them, I think more disparities will occur and grievances will remanifest. What are the goals of the left in the broader Middle East, and how do they relate? And how do these relate to the tasks facing the left here? The goals of the Middle Eastern left, from what I understand, is to completely end military and economic interference of the U.S. in the region. And I feel as if the majority of the resources of the Middle Eastern left are probably being set to deal with that goal. For the American left, I feel as if we occupy a somewhat unique position within the leftist struggle internationally, where I think our actions should be dictated by the actions of our counterparts in the rest of the world. Due to the fact that we live within the center of global imperialism and capitalism, we must first and foremost support the activities of the non-Western left and construct our policy in line with their struggles as a central guiding factor. By allowing the actions of our leftist allies across the globe to dictate our policies, we have less of a chance of potentially sabotaging their movements and can be informed what strategies are best to support them by those who understand the local conditions most thoroughly.
Mahdy, I'll get you to wrap up.
Oh, okay. In that case, I will go on to which way forward for Palestinian liberation, as I feel this is an important section. Currently, what I think can be done by leftists is to partake in activities whether possible, to withhold support from Israel and its allies, be them states, governments, agencies, companies, political parties, any or other individual organizations that support the ongoing oppression of Palestinians. These activities need to be done concurrently in order to have a desired effect. And we should be using tactics to address and target specific interests that the US government has, and perpetuating the existence of Israel is necessary to achieve political change. These interests coalesced around the profitability to US corporations and military industry that Israel provides. Some examples that I think should be taken are boycotts, protests outside of key strategic locations, withholding votes and donations to politicians who don't support a ceasefire, along with activities that are more specific to our local conditions. And with that, I will go to a close.
Great, thank you.
Sorry.
That's great. Okay, take it away.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by making some comments about the October 7th catastrophe. I'd like to begin by saying a few words about some of the responses of some people on the American left. And for me, that means people who identify as socialists, to the events of October 7th, when Hamas fighters broke through the barriers encircling the Gaza Strip, brutally slaughtered 1,200 Israeli men, women, and children, injured thousands more, and seized 250 hostages. As Hamas leaders certainly knew would happen, Israel's government then declared renewed war on Hamas, imposed a draconian siege on the territory, cutting off power, food, water, and medical supplies, and then launched a military invasion that has cost the lives of an estimated 12,000 Gazan men, women, and children, and left much of the area a sea of rubble. After a short ceasefire and the exchange of some hostages for Palestinians imprisoned in Israel, the world is waiting to see when the fighting will resume. There is much that we can criticize Israel for over the course of its 75-year existence. That the Israeli state is largely responsible for the plight of Palestinians in Gaza and on the West Bank is beyond question. It is also clear that the long-standing situation in which the Israeli state has virtually imprisoned Palestinians in Gaza and created a system of apartheid on the West Bank must come to an end. And yet, the victims of the Hamas attack of October 7th did not deserve their gruesome fate. They were simply living their lives just as we are when we go about our business on the lands seized from the indigenous people of the Willamette Valley 170 years ago. We don't expect to be killed in that way, and neither did they. But Hamas sees it differently. As one leader, Zabiar Ali Khan, put it, the people killed on October 7th were, quote, colonizers, settlers, the primary agents, actors, impellers of the colonization and genocide of Palestine, unquote. In his view, quote, a colonizer is a colonizer, in uniform or out. To destroy them, he said, quote, we must raise the banner of searing bullets and blood-stained knives. We must utilize every tool toward collective liberation from Haifa to Al-Nakab and from the river to the sea. By liberation, Hamas means destroying the state of Israel and establishing a theocratic Islamic dictatorship like the one they had established in Gaza for the last 17 years, and in which all dissent has been crushed. No socialists should support such a movement in the name of Palestine liberation or anything else. The Israeli government may often carry out murderous policies against Palestinians, but one should not associate with murderers to protest against murder. And yet, that is what some American socialists have done recently. As early as July 2023, the DSA's Palestine Solidarity Working Group had asserted Hamas's right to attack civilians. It tweeted, one could and should very well argue that in a settler colonial context, there are no such things as civilians. But discarding that even, it's total folly to honestly compare settlers perpetrating pogroms to resistance groups deploying violence to liberate themselves, unquote. On October 7th, DSA chapters reveled in Hamas's achievement. The Connecticut chapter of DSA trumpeted that, quote, yesterday the Palestinian resistance launched an unprecedented anti-colonial struggle. Despite 75 years of occupation, Palestinians are standing tall against apartheid. These sentiments were echoed by the DSA International Committee, which called upon comrades, quote, to stand with the resistance, unquote. No condemnation of Hamas, no empathy for the victims. Instead, DSA basically adopted Hamas's line that there is no difference between civilian and military personnel. The organization has not backed down from this position, but insists that indigenous resistance in all forms is valid. In my view, socialism is about the struggle for a humane, democratic, and egalitarian society. In my view, the principles of solidarity, anti-imperialism, and anti-militarism are at the core of what it means to be a socialist. And to me, a truly socialist organization is one that tolerates dissent and rejects dogmatism. That is why I was appalled and heartbroken when I saw the reaction of the DSA, the largest socialist organization in the United States and the only one that has any possibility of having clout in our political discourse via its representatives in the House. That is why I was upset by their reaction. By aligning itself with a group that aims at the establishment of a theocratic tyranny, the organization demonstrates that it has lost its moral grounding and detached itself from its democratic socialist principles. So, what then are the origins of the conflict in Palestine? The basic contours of the Palestinian conflict can be traced back to the rise of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century, as some European Jews sought a solution to their oppression in the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which was then controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Launched by Theodor Herzl in 1897, for decades it won little support. In face of massive discrimination and violent pogroms, over 2 million Jews left Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But relatively few went to Palestine. 85% went to the United States, 12% went to other countries like Canada and Argentina, and only 3% went to Palestine. The situation began to change in the First World War. In 1917, the British government attempted to win Jewish support by promising to establish a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine once the Ottoman Empire was defeated. After the Allied victory and the dismantling of the Ottoman state, Britain occupied Palestine and permitted increased Jewish immigration. Conditions in Palestine changed radically when the United States shut the doors to Eastern European migration in the early 1920s, and when the Nazis seized power in Germany in 1933. During the interwar period, Jewish immigration into Palestine increased rapidly, with over 150,000 Jews arriving between 1933 and 1935. The Jewish population rose substantially, but it remained a minority. By 1941, there were about 900,000 Muslims, 60% of the total, and 475,000 Jews in the territory, 31%. Rising Jewish immigration fueled growing tensions with the Arab population, resulting in the Arab Revolt from 1936 to 39. The British put down the revolt, but also decided to limit further Jewish migration to Palestine, as Joel mentioned before. This remained their policy until they lost control a decade later. World War II and the Holocaust fundamentally altered the situation in Europe and Palestine. In the wake of the genocide that had almost annihilated them across Europe, few Jews could return home or wished to do so. At the same time, they had few places to go. No countries opened their doors to large numbers of stateless Jews, and this made Zionism a more popular option for them. As the numbers of Jewish migrants increased after 1945, pressure on the British intensified from Arab and Jewish anti-colonial forces within Palestine and from the United States and Russia. In the end, the United Nations decided to partition the territory, an action that precipitated civil war in 1947 and the driving of over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs from their homes. Since the end of the conflict in 1948, the Palestinians have been prevented by law from returning to their homes and claiming their property. After 1949, Jewish immigration to the new state of Israel increased markedly from around the world. And today, the Arab Israeli population is only about 20% of the total. So to sum up, in my view, for the last 100 years, the conflict in Palestine has been fundamentally rooted in Western racism and colonialism. In the first place, Europe's Jews were literally driven off the continent by the genocidal policies of Nazi Germany and its helpers, and by other powers, including the United States, that closed their doors to Jewish immigration. In the second place, the majority Arab population in Palestine was subject to domination and expropriation under the policies of the territory's British colonial masters, who, by promising to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, opened the door to expanded Jewish immigration. The end result was partition and war, which has led to the consolidation of the State of Israel and the exodus of most Palestinians to the peripheral areas of Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, and elsewhere. Over the past 75 years, Israel has developed into an economically and militarily powerful, multi-ethnic state with a parliamentary system that functions well for those included in the political body. This includes Jews and also Palestinian Arabs who are second-class citizens but can participate in the political life of the country. At the same time, the Israeli state, often using brutal and even murderous methods, has engaged in colonial encroachment on the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, and it has created an apartheid system that seals off Palestinian areas in the occupied territories from those seized by Jewish settlers. It is a great irony and tragedy that after being nearly exterminated by European ethnic nationalist states, the Jews who created Israel created a similar entity. It is true that full membership in the Israeli national community does not rest upon ethnicity. Israel is indeed a complex multi-ethnic state, but the use of religious criteria in the determination of citizenship has replaced the exclusivity of the ethnic nationalist states of the past. The result has been our disastrous present. So what to do now? Well, first and foremost, democratic socialists should support a ceasefire in Gaza. The current war will not resolve any of the underlying problems of the region, such as the occupation, settlements, Israel's colonial apartheid rule, or the dead end of terrorism. Israel's collective punishment of Gaza is a war crime, and that must end. Israel can level Gaza and kill tens of thousands more, but that will solve nothing. As Joel has noted, Palestinian armed force cannot threaten the existence of the Israeli state. Nor will it be possible for the Israeli state to destroy Hamas, root and branch, via conquest. Fundamentally, the American left should remain steadfast in its call for Palestinian self-determination. It should condemn the far-right government of Benjamin Netanyahu, in which fascist elements openly advocate ethnic cleansing. It should call for the end of illegal settlements on the West Bank and the illegal annexation of East Jerusalem, and it should demand an end to U.S. military aid to Israel. Finally, we should demand political and civil equality for all Israeli citizens, Jewish, Arab, Druze, Bedouin. It is unclear what kind of new constitutional settlement will be possible in Israel and Palestine, or what forces will be able to negotiate an agreement. Neither Hamas nor the current Israeli government have the legitimacy to do so. As a socialist, I would prefer a democratic republic where all citizens would have equal rights. In a region divided for so long, however, a two-state solution may be the only practical way forward. I don't think any of us in the room right now have any idea about what the settlement would look like or who can negotiate it. Maybe we'll discuss that in the question and answer. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Chance for remarks back and forth. I just wanted observations on the panel. I think all three panelists agree that the current crisis has been brought about by right-wing politicization on both sides, and that perhaps maybe there's some disagreement about, to what extent the left is in some position to intervene. I think, Joel, you may be quite pessimistic, but we could bring that up.
Yeah, I'm usually the pessimist. I've always said that the most pessimistic person in the room when speaking about Israel-Palestine has never been wrong.
Well, there you go.
Unfortunately true.
So there's this, and I do wonder, thinking about Mahdy was bringing up the issue of a long-term project, and Joel also kind of reflecting on a long-term project all the way back to the 1920s of the Palestinian Communist Party. Is this an occasion for starting something long-term? Joel noted that political leadership as well as misleadership had an international dimension to it with the Soviet Union. But also reflecting on this long-standing view that socialists and communists should be working, the working classes of an international character. The working class doesn't have a nationalist dimension to it. The U.S. left does appear to be strategically placed, as Bill pointed out, and I think all three of you sort of mentioned this. But it's putting pressure on the U.S. left with the Democratic Socialists of America unraveling this explosive growth that happened around the time of the Saunders campaign. And I did wonder about this growth, the extent to which it admitted it included groups like the International Socialist Organization collapsed, and many of those members who may have had different views on the Palestine issue and how to approach it entered the Democratic Socialists of America. In some ways, the unraveling is kind of on the basis of that. And hearing you bring up Tony Cliff also made me think of this. Tony Cliff as being, in some ways, the descendant of that kind of political organization, having, all the way from Palestine an impact back in the U.S. So I guess Bill, I wonder how you feel about sort of the merging and the elements that came into the DSA and how, maybe it was not a solid foundation. But for all of you and for the people in the room who are thinking about, this history of the left in Palestine and, thinking about a long-term project like Mahdy has put on the table, what lessons can be learned from all of this history that could inform, a long-term project? What should we be pulling from this history? What mistakes should not be repeated? But you don't have to answer that, but you may have your own comments with one another. Maybe we'll go in reverse order.
Okay. So I guess the first thing that was on your list was the issue of the internal politics of the DSA. So I have to say there, it's very difficult to discern, at least from Salem, Oregon, where I do most of my work, what is going on at the national level. And it is possible to note that over the last 4 or 5 years, in the wake of the growth of the organization, which went from about 5,000 or 6,000 people to maybe 85 or 90,000 members over the course of 4 or 5 years after Sanders' campaign, there was a definite shift to the left at the national level. For example, the national organization voted to leave the Socialist International, right, which was greeted, I think, by many who were further to the left than DSA, who had then gone into DSA after the growth of the organization. As you say, many groups, many individuals from many groups joined DSA after it became pretty clear that DSA was the only game in town. I don't want to say that those groups practiced entryism, right, as individual blocks trying to go in and shift the politics of the organization. But I think that over the long run, there was a shift, and it moved decisively to the left. I don't know to what extent any individuals from those movements are involved in the decisions that were made in the International Committee, for example, about positions taken on October 7th. Right? But certainly, a kind of rhetoric, a kind of language has been adopted that is very different from that of the DSA just a short time ago. And so I think some positions like the ones I outlined would be considered right-wing positions within the organization. So I think that's generally what has happened. But I don't have specific names to line up with specific policies. And this is, I think, also a problem within the DSA. It is an extremely complicated organization, and the discourse within it is sort of an online discourse. So unless you have lots of time to devote, right, to engaging in this online world of discussion that is not carried out in any kind of national press, they have no real press, right, then it's difficult to discern sometimes what is actually happening at the top.
Any reactions to your co-panelists?
Does anybody in the audience care much about the internal debates within DSA? Raise your hand if you care.
Yeah.
Small amount.
Not much worth.
Yeah.
Not much worth discussing then.
Yeah.
May I just say
Not that it's not important, but not that it's not important. DSA, as Bill said, is the largest socialist organization in the country, but its internal debates are, as he suggested, obscurantist.
Yeah. If I might just add, though, I mean, why this is important is because there are DSA exponents in the House of Representatives, right? Which is
None of whom share the ridiculous positions that you quoted.
no, and that's why they're in trouble in the DSA. Right? They are.
I would say that's why the DSA is in trouble.
That's why the DSA is in trouble. Right.
Okay.
The circular firing squad is at work.
Mahdy.
I will say, in my opinion, the DSA as an organization acts, from what I've seen, acts less as a unified political coalition and more like every single chapter is some homegrown sort of manifestation of leftist elements. And I feel as if because of this decentralized, disconnected nature, it kind of becomes hard to determine, well, what is the actual like national policy of the DSA? I think it becomes very difficult to determine that because it's usually varies so wildly from the chapter to chapter basis that getting a statement from the national policy, from the national, DSA doesn't really. That won't tell you enough. That won't actually tell you much about your chapter-to-chapter politics.
Agree.
Do you have any comments from to what you hear from the other panelists?
No, other than I'm very grateful to be able to be here.
Phil.
So I'm going to suggest that Mahdy made a fundamental philosophical error in how he laid out his analysis by emphasizing what he called external over internal. That's deeply anti-Marxist, it's anti-Hegelian, it's also just fundamentally problematic in whatever terms. If you plant a seed in the ground, you assume that it's going to grow because there will be sun and because there will be rain, or you'll water it or whatever, right? Wrong. If that seed is not fertile to begin with, it won't grow no matter how much sun or no matter how much rain or water you put on it. The basis of all change, of anything, is internal. That means that whatever future there is going to be, and I'm not particularly optimistic that it's going to be one that people who call themselves leftists would be happy with, in Israel-Palestine, the basis is going to be coming from the internal social composition of that territory between the river and the sea. What goes on around it, both regionally and in terms of big power politics, American imperialism, that will certainly have an influence. The fundamental motor of all change is internal. That also tells us what the international left can and can't do, because we aren't going to be leading any kind of process like that, especially not in the United States, where we have an enormous task to overcome the very deep and complex alliance of our own ruling class and all of its media apparatus, and all of the political economy of the country. There are 200 Israeli firms listed on the NASDAQ. Israeli high-tech people commute between Silicon Valley and Israel every other week. I know people like that. So the two countries are very closely linked. Still, the United States is not going to be dictating to Israel what it should do. We have the potential to change what our ruling class does. How we should go about that very complicated discussion that we should have. Proceeding from this philosophical error, Mahdy made two other errors which I think are pretty important. First is imagining that we are still in the era of national liberation. That was a very important moment in global history. Broadly speaking, say from the end of World War I up through the end of the Cold War, with some wrinkles on either side. That era is over. And part of why people in DSA could have such a weird notion of what Hamas represented on October 7th and even before, as you noted, is because they don't understand what time of day it is. Now, that's not to say that peoples don't have the right to self-determination. I believe that they do, but that period was a very specific period with certain characteristics in which forces like Nasser's Egypt, the Ba'ath, the Algerian National Liberation Front were very important and ultimately failed to come up with a left project because it's a long story. So if people do deserve the right to self-determination, well, then you can't say only people whose exercise of the right to self-determination will help to defeat U.S. imperialism have that right. Other people don't have that right. Either people do or they don't. And if they do, then some people may want to exercise their right of self-determination in a way that actually helps American imperialism. Ukraine, for example. Do we favor that Russia should have invaded Ukraine and not been opposed because supporting Ukraine builds NATO, does all manner of other things? I mean, we have an argument about how should the United States have supported and all of that kind of thing. But Do people of Ukraine deserve to be conquered by Russia because opposing Russia would strengthen the United States? That seems weird to me. And then finally, last category error, that the American left should follow the leadership of the left of the global South. Been there, done that. Third worldism was also an important moment in global history. The Algerians were the focal point of it in many ways, and we saw where that led. That does not lead to a leftist project. That leads to a nationalist project. So either we are leftists, meaning that we believe that internationalist solidarity and not identity politics forms the basis of our political affiliations, or we're nationalists, in which case that's not my politics at all.
Before we go, yeah, get a chance to respond.
I just want to thank you. I think I obviously have made some grave errors in that regard, and I'd like to thank you for being able to help me correct my analysis. Not fall into these pits. I think your point.
All right, questions from the audience. Thank you. The exchange. Yes, please.
I want to address the first analogy that you made, because you made an analogy about the seed, the fertile seed. If it's not fertile, then it's not going to grow. If I leave a fertile seed in my room, sitting next to the, like underneath the bed, it's also not going to grow. I'm curious about why, if anyone could give me some perspective, I guess, why there's so much Zionist propaganda that's in English and seems to be pointed at the Western world, if we are going to somehow benefit that by swinging one way or another. Because I see your point, if we're not there, we're not at the table ourselves. It's an internal thing. Understandable, makes sense. But I want to understand better why, when the IOF came in with their medical supplies, it said medical supplies in English as they're going to Al-Shifa Hospital, actually carrying guns and all that, trying to just kind of stage a little space for Zionist propaganda.
You misunderstood what I meant by internal. In my presentation, I said there are 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians who live between the river and the sea. Both peoples are part of the internal. So the project for the left is whether or not it's possible to unite any significant elements of those peoples across the national divide. The historic record is that the left has failed. That's clear enough. I still think that's a preferable form of politics than nationalism. Why is Zionist propaganda so ubiquitous, not only in English, you could say in French or German too, for that matter? Because Zionism is a Western settler colonial movement that shares a great deal in common with North American, Australian, New Zealand settler colonial movements. It speaks of it has a very similar politics, very similar racial exclusivity and hierarchy and all of that. So that's natural. Then the Palestinian national movement has an extra dimension of disability over and above all the anti-colonial national movements that came into being during the period that I mentioned, because it's Muslim tinged. The majority of the Palestinians are Muslims. And so we have the whole tradition of Islamophobia in the West that in some respects goes back to the Crusades, but let's just say 18th, 19th century European imperialism was married to anti-Muslim sentiment in South Asia, in the Middle East, in North Africa, and so on. So it's a pretty heavy burden to bear. So we shouldn't be shocked by where we are. And the enormity of that problem should not drag us into an exclusivist solution to the problem.
Okay, Mike.
So I think a lot of the conflict in Israel-Palestine is supported by the United States. It's United States military aid to Israel, unconditioned military support and financial support kind of liberates the Israeli right wing to do whatever they want, and that's so I think there's no pressure on Israel to accommodate or to come to an agreement with the Palestinians, and so I think U.S. aid is very significant in the outcomes there, and so I think conditioning U.S. aid could make a difference, U.S. aid, U.S. will provide aid if new settlements stop or if settlements are abandoned. Of course, it's been impossible in the United States Congress to put those sorts of conditions on it because of the AIPAC, influence on Congress, the kind of the lock on public, which partly based on public opinion, a lock on public opinion in the United States. But I think that public opinion is starting to shift now, and with like 66% of people in the United States support a ceasefire, which our government is not supporting and which the Israeli government is not supporting. And so I think that I'm not going to praise Hamas, but I'd say that this October 7th invasion has created a situation where the American public has become more aware of what the situation is, and it's becoming obvious to many people that our government and the Israeli government is not doing anything that we like. And so I'd say that this creates an opportunity for the left of the United States to start influencing what the policy of the United States is, where I think we could probably get close to a majority of people, if not a single congressperson, who would be willing to condition U.S. aid to Israel. I shouldn't say not a single congressman. I think Bernie Sanders and now Clark and Merkley have both said that in the Senate that they would prefer conditions on U.S. aid. So anyway, so I think the recent events in the fighting in Israel has created an opportunity because of the greater awareness of the American public about what is going on there. And so I'd like your comments on that, and do you think that we're any closer to a resolution, or by through this process of getting withdrawal of U.S. support for whatever the right wing in Israel wants to do?
Mahdy, this goes straight to the point in your presentation as well, where you were talking about the bipartisan basis, and I guess part of me wonders the extent of this is a left issue anymore. There might be conservatives who are also.
Well, I would still say definitely it is a left issue in regards that I think it's extremely important for the left. And although I do think conservative individuals and conservative politics, conservative elements within the U.S. are starting to support, maybe turn the tide of support against Israel. I think that is still technically a left opinion. It's just coming from someone who is not very, how should I say, someone who is generally not a leftist. They're still expressing a left opinion. I think it should be very, though at the same time, I mentioned bipartisan in the sense of a two-party structure. I prefer if they have.
Well, I guess, Joel, you seem pessimistic that even if the U.S. were to, that this problem will not be solved by the U.S., by Joe Biden putting pressure on Israel to do one thing or other. The problem is more deep than that. Is that correct?
Yeah. Do we imagine that going into an election year in which his chances to win were at best questionable, Joe Biden is going to spend every cent of political capital he has to put pressure on Israel to achieve a resolution to the conflict along lines that not only the current government of Israel, but every government of Israel that Israel has had going back to 2009, and then with a 1.5 year gap going back to 2001 has had. Does that sound like we're living in the real world? No, that is not going to happen. The fact that the majority of American people don't like the foreign policy of the United States with regard to Israel-Palestine does not easily translate into anything. The majority of the American people want national health insurance. Do we have it? A big majority. Majority of American people support abortion rights. Do we have it? Majority of American people support student loan amnesty. Do we have that? The majority of American people support subsidized preschool care. Do we have that? No. So what we have is a ruling class which has increasingly seized control of the political system on the spurious notion that corporations are people and dollars are speech and all bets are off. Already, even before all of that stuff happened, we had a barely democratic system. Remember the history of this country? Black people didn't vote in the South until the 1960s, and we're supposed to be the citadel of democracy. And the Supreme Court has rolled that back in recent years too. So we don't have a very democratic system in the United States, and we never have had one. There's also the Electoral College and all of the ways in which anti-majoritarianism is built into the Constitution of the United States. Intentionally, read the Federalist Papers, it was put there in order to frustrate the will of the majority. So the fact that the majority of the American people believe one thing or another does not easily translate itself into policy. What could translate itself into policy? As I think we all agree, the American relationship with Israel is part of the global structure of American imperial hegemony, and it has certain particularities in the Middle East. And what supports that? The military-industrial complex and the military budget, which makes up half of all the money that the United States government spends. So a broad view that would say, we need to stop spending money on weapons, most of which don't even work very well anyway, and most of which should never be used anyway, like nuclear weapons. We need to spend money on domestic political needs. A broad campaign like that, in which everybody wins, doesn't matter if you're white or black or whatever else, everybody wins, and the military-industrial complex loses, that's potentially a majoritarian position, which I think is about as solidly left. It's rooted in the history of the left going all the way back to the German Social Democratic Party, as Bill will know, except they fell apart on it in World War I. That's the beginning of the catastrophic history of the left of the 20th century.
So I would just like to say something about Mike's comment about American military aid to Israel. I'm not an expert in Israeli political economy, but from what I do know, the Israeli economy is a very significant one and is multifaceted and has a very substantial military production component of its own, right? And they are not completely dependent on American military aid. In fact, I would wager that the $3.8 billion in official aid that we give every year is a small fraction of their general outlays. And that even if it was significant, Israel is in a position to do without it. If they felt that their interests, right, however reactionary they might be, are more important than what the United States is telling them to do, they could do without that annual infusion of American military aid. I think that's been the case for a very long time, and I think that aid, while significant, is more symbolic than anything else. It's driven by internal American politics, not actually by Israeli need for American weapons. The other thing is that my understanding is that in an immediate sense, we sent over, boatloads of bombs to assist them in the current war in Gaza, and that may be true, but I suspect that they have their own stockpiles, and they've long had them, and that too, right, was largely symbolic, right, and was designed to shore up the American government's position on Israel, its public position.
If I could just tag on to what Bill said, because I totally agree. U.S. military aid to Israel is about 10% of Israel's GDP and about 17% of its defense budget. So significant, but they could live without it if they decided they wanted to.
Lance, and then the person in the back, go ahead.
So I guess my question's coming from, might be an odd niche, as the majority of the people I interact with in the sphere of this discussion are internationalist leftists, but a position that I've seen that is at least relatively common is looking at the sides of the conflict. Obviously, you have Israel, who's supported by American interests and who's a far-right, party at this point, almost a one-party state, except when Netanyahu was kicked out by that very broad coalition. You have Hamas, who's the Islamist organization, which is openly religious, openly extremist religious, and then even presupposing that a secular republic could exist in the region, that would be a liberal capitalist state as well. So I guess just looking at the history of the left and when there were movements or things like revolutionary defeatism, when internationalism was much more prevalent, are there any options for the left? I want to hear the opinions of all the panelists. Besides just sticking, our guns behind one of these capitalist options, is there a horizon for internationalism? Is there a horizon for moving beyond this kind of minimalist demand of just a ceasefire, or just a democratic republic, or just Israel, or just Palestine?
Well, I've been teaching about German social democracy for a long time, right? And all those hopes were cherished, and all of them were dashed many times, that we just outlined. And I would argue that those things that you're describing, the idea of creating a democratic republic, say, if we could just achieve that, even within a capitalist framework, that to me would be an enormous historic step forward. Right? And I'm sure that Marx says somewhere, right, or maybe it was Engels, that the democratic republic, right, is the framework within which one fights, right, for socialism, right. And so I don't dismiss those gains, right, anymore. I think those are really important. I don't see on the horizon, especially in the near term, any kind of unified international left movement that could put together a fundamentally revolutionary alternative to that, unfortunately.
I would agree. I would agree quite frankly that any movement that happens within Israel-Palestine, I don't think a socialist movement is going to be the emerging victorious force. It will likely be a liberal force of some kind, in order to at least have any kind of chance of stopping the present violence. Not that it will have a continuation of some violence to some degree. And as well, I don't think, I'm not even sure within my lifetime, which is, I'm not that old, I'm only 21. But even within my lifetime, I'm not entirely confident that we will see any kind of, a more revolutionary position, or even a liberal position, state to come about. I'm not sure about that.
So, as continuing the pessimism that I established myself on, we have to take seriously that socialism suffered an enormous defeat in the 20th century. You don't just, let's dust ourselves off and let's just carry it. We can't do that. I mean, we have to be able to point to some social forces that are going to carry that project, which is going to look different in the 21st century than it looked in the 20th century or the 19th century. Anyway, that said, and I will agree with my friend Yazid Sayegh, who said on October 7th, Hamas destroyed everything we had built for the last 10 years in support of Palestinian rights. So there's been a huge setback that has been suffered. Because anybody who talks about Palestinian rights and Palestinian self-determination, the next sentence is going to be, well, but do you support Hamas? You know, blah, 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 blah. And we have to talk about that. I think it's clear that we don't, but all right. All that said, in the middle of this horrific scene, there's an organization of Palestinian citizens and Israeli citizens of Israel called Standing Together. They don't use big words like socialism, and they don't talk about how many states they want to have. They say that all the people between the river and the sea should be treated, have equal rights, and that there should be democracy. And they work on things like minimum wage and housing and so forth. And they decided that they're going to have a solidarity meeting. So this is not Palestinians in the West Bank under occupation, and clearly not those in Gaza. This is an Israeli organization, but 21% of all the citizens of Israel are Palestinians, a fact that most of the Jewish citizens of Israel don't like to remember. But it's an important fact because those Palestinians are the ones best situated to lead any kind of a progressive movement, in my opinion. So they decided they're going to have a solidarity meeting. And because the head of the Israeli police, the minister in charge of the Israeli police, is an actual fascist terrorist, he's been convicted of supporting terrorism, that's Itamar Ben-Gvir, he ordered the police not to let them have the meeting. And eventually they were able to have this meeting anyway in a mosque in Haifa. 300 people came. 300 people, Palestinian Arabs and Jewish Israelis, in the middle of a brutal war to be in solidarity with each other. It was so successful that they repeated it in Jaffa, in Lydda, and in Jerusalem. So these are both small things. We're talking about hundreds of people among, even if we just say the population of Israel is 9-ish million people. But this is the model. People who say, no, we don't support slaughtering Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and we don't support Hamas slaughtering Israeli civilians. We believe in Arab-Jewish solidarity. That's what it means to be left. So people are doing it. That doesn't mean I give Standing Together my blanket support. But it's a good example of people who think of themselves as leftists who are doing something positive.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to make a point about what was being discussed before about the utility of trying to work to make aid to Israel conditional. First of all, 10% of the economy is a pretty substantial amount when you consider that most governments have a lot of things that they have to pay for before they even start talking about cutting things. Secondly, the Financial Times just released a study recently of the effect of this genocide on the Israeli economy, and it's been devastating. I don't think it's widely circulated enough. And I know we don't trust the Financial Times for its economic analysis, but when they talk specifically about the number of businesses that have been permanently shut down because of the cost of this war, and the tourist industry potentially being devastated indefinitely. I mean, the suffering is going to continue to go on when they stop bombing it because the infrastructure is being destroyed. I think we can build on this. And I think it's possible that we can raise a lot of awareness at the very least by making that an issue. Because it should be conditional. It always should have been conditional. It's illegal to give aid to apartheid governments. Governments are, committing war crimes on a routine basis. I just am not nearly as pessimistic about the value of working on something like that.
Yeah. So, I don't really disagree with anything that you said, other than I don't think the Israelis, who are, especially the ones who are currently in power, will base their policies on how much the people suffer. I think first of all, our aid to Israel shouldn't be conditional. I don't think there should be any aid at all. Okay, and for a long time, I mean, they're a rich country, right? They want to build bombs, they can build them themselves. Okay, so that's my point of departure. But we are giving them, and in this debate about whether or not this aid will have a big impact on Israeli policy or not, I don't think so. I think if they are committed to a policy of the radical right, I think they will sacrifice the Israeli economy. They will sacrifice the well-being of the Israeli people to accomplish their aims. Just like Hamas is willing to, and I hate to use this term because it has nothing to do with martyrdom, to martyr, as they say, tens of thousands of their own people, right, in order to make their political point.
So if I may respond really quickly, I just want to say that the goal isn't to immediately force Israel to change. The goal is to make this an issue in the United States that we can actually debate.
Agreed.
And hopefully this will lead to more that will eventually put that kind of pressure on. Netanyahu, according to all the polls, Netanyahu is gone. I mean, they are going to pay a political price. The coalition is going to fall apart.
We don't disagree. I mean, yeah, no military aid to Israel. There's no. Why should Israel get military aid? They shouldn't get military aid. It's a violation of the Leahy amendments and all of that kind of stuff, for sure. It won't force a change in their policy. It will force a change in the debate and the terms of debate about Israel-Palestine in the United States. Maybe it'll force a debate about the military budget of the United States, but it's not going to change their policy. Netanyahu is being the motor of the current government. Are people who believe that Judaizing the entire territory between the river and the sea, and therefore potentially driving the population of the Gaza Strip into Egypt, except that Egypt won't be having that, is bringing the Messianic age closer.
Right.
Now, I'm sorry if you don't think that's serious, but these people really believe that. You don't argue with people who believe that. No political problem is of any consequence if that's what you believe, in the same way that no political problem is of any consequence to Hamas if they believe that they're going to be martyred and go to heaven and whatever is motivating them. These are not discussions that secular leftists can easily engage in productively.
At the back, and then those will be the last two questions at the back, and then we're running short of time, so we'll go. Let's if we can make them three quick ones, that'd be dope. And Taylor, go ahead.
Wonderful. So I have a question specifically more Berlin, but basically. Well, Nelson Mandela, who's obviously a very prominent socialist, he sort of agreed initially with nonviolence, like that whole idea when obviously comes with reform things and obviously get rid of apartheid. But eventually the ANC started using violent means to try to bring attention to their cause, to try to make reform happen, and ultimately that was successful. But you sort of seem to be extremely against violence in any way, or that's I'm not exactly sure. But I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more as to what you think is what it means for reform for Palestinians.
Well, first of all, I'm not against violence, I'm not a pacifist. I think violence sometimes has its place. What I objected to most in the Hamas action was not taking a military action against the Israeli military, right? It was what they did to civilians, right? And this decision that they have made that any civilian is the equivalent of a soldier because they are settlers. Well, think about how that applies to everybody sitting in this room. Okay? So it's an untenable policy. You can't pursue it, right, with any hope of civilization surviving.
Or to them, right?
Sorry?
Or to the Palestinians. You could, if you go your time scale back, instead of back 100 years, back 1,000 years, the Ottoman Empire is based on colonial
Sure.
settlement too, right?
Yeah.
But the question of violence is first and foremost a strategic one. Can they win that way? And in this case, the answer is very clearly they can't. So if you can't win that way, and you will ruin your reputation among everybody in the world, basically, because of committing atrocities against civilians, then why do it? We're not then in the realm of a rational discussion. It's not Algeria, where the Algerian National Liberation Front could impose a level of violence that would ultimately force the French colonial settlers to go back to France, even though most of them actually never came from France to begin with, but that's more complicated. But in this case, it's not even remotely possible. So it's a false analogy.
Did you want to comment on this question? Okay, you're next. Sorry.
I think that 210 Palestinian hostages being brought back from jails in exchange for 99 is a pretty big one. And I feel like if the purpose is to bring back Palestinians to their families, they succeeded in that.
Those people will be arrested within the year. Those people will be rearrested within the year. Where did they go back? They went back to the West Bank, which Israel rules.
Doesn't mean that they don't deserve to come back to their families at least for a while. At least for a while. I think that you're more free at least with your family. That's one. Two, I feel like a lot of the things that happened were shown, at least with different, at least from what I've seen. I saw an article that was talking about how on October 7th, at least at the festival, Hamas had no idea about the festival happening because it was released on Tuesday. That they were also going to be adding Saturday to it and not just, Thursday Friday. But a lot of people that were killed by the Israeli military, by their planes.
You don't know that. You can't prove that.
I don't know anything.
That's Hamas propaganda. You don't know that. No independent verification of that is possible.
It's in Haaretz.
IDF is talking about, yes, it's in Haaretz. It's in the Jerusalem Post.
I'm sorry, there has been no independent verification that a large number of Israelis were killed by their own forces.
The Palestine Chronicle has it as well.
Please.
From November 18th,
Palestine Chronicle is obviously a Palestinian source.
obviously.
So we're going to have a propaganda war about if Hamas killed only 400 civilians, then they're cool. But if they kill 800, they're not
It's not about them
cool.
being cool or not. We don't want to talk about that. We just want to talk about what the goal is. And if the goal, for example, is to bring back Palestinians to their families, I think that makes sense. But I guess my
So
question
how many Palestinians do you think should die in the Gaza Strip for 150 or however many it was Palestinians to go back to their families, quite likely temporarily?
Well, that's up to Israel, not us.
Yeah, it's a disproportionate reaction that's moved by
Indeed it
the
is.
United States.
Indeed it is. And Hamas knew that was coming, otherwise they're political imbeciles.
Of course they're political imbeciles, because they're after money. They're not after people. And so, I mean, like,
Who was after money?
Israel is going to be after money and their own political desires. That like they're going to blow up the entire strip if they want to, and that's not the point. If an armed resistance is going to seek a few members of people that have been in solitary confinement of the size of graves for 10 years, and Israel decides that it is their global opportunity to capitalize on the fact that a armed resistance in fact did commit violence, and then decided to use that in conjunction with Western propaganda to bulldoze like the entire Gaza Strip, of course that's a disproportionate reaction, but that doesn't mean that the initial desire to rescue people hostages, because they weren't like, no, there's no way that every single one of those hostages were arrested for legitimate reasons. Therefore, they're not prisoners, they're hostages. And so to try to rescue your own people, your hostages, I feel like that's a valid use of violence.
And how many of your own people are you willing to be responsible for the death of in order to do that?
Are you saying that Israel would be killing?
Yes.
Or
I mean, Israel killed them all. There's no debate about that.
can't control what they're doing.
Do you think that
I think that in an
is there any is there any requirement that a political organization have some responsibility for the consequences of its actions?
Yes.
We can denounce Israel from morning till night for the bombing of the Gaza Strip and for the land invasion and all of that, and everybody I know does.
And for shooting
But
Jewish people
but-
on October
but
7th at the
if
time.
Hamas did what it did on October 7th, there was no way that wasn't going to happen. So were they willing to kill their own people, have their own people killed, or were they stupid? Those are the two options.
both.
Okay, we're gonna have to, we've got 15 minutes left, and I know there's a
There
stack of
was one
people.
gentleman there in the middle who had his hand up, who was not heard.
Okay,
I had my hand up.
okay, so we've got Talo, yourself, and that hand. Those are the last three questions, comments. Talo, you were first in this stack.
Actually quick, for Joel, you listed like 3 Trotskyist or internationalist figures, including, what is it, Tony Cliff. Could you just repeat or like even spell out the other names?
So Tony Cliff is the best known because, do we have a marker here? I've got one more. That doesn't work.
I've got one after.
While you're doing
I can
that,
do it. I'll do it over here. That's
Okay.
that's
I have a working marker, okay.
I don't care.
Whether it works.
All right.
There you go.
Wish for the pronunciation of the chalkboard.
Okay, so Tony Cliff, originally a Jew born in Palestine, this is his nom de guerre, and became the founder of the British Socialist Worker Party and the whole international socialist tendency. Gilbert Ashkar, now professor at SOAS, written lots of good books. I don't always agree with him, but he's always a smart guy. And Michael Warshawski has also a bunch of books that are probably out of print now. That's his nom de guerre, Mikado. So those are the 3. Unfortunately, no women.
okay, thank you. You're next.
So I want to talk about like what other ways did the Palestinians do to be able to resist, right? So you said when you were talking, you said that Hamas was created in 1988. Was that right? Is that the
Yes,
year?
around there, yeah. 87 years.
So we know that Hamas was not created as soon as the Nakba happened, or like right off the bat when Israel was created, right? And we know that Israel has been just massacred. You said that there was no genocide, or Israelis did not commit a genocide against the Israelis, against the Palestinians, like the U.S. and Australians, right? That the Israelis did not commit a genocide. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah, so the Israelis did not commit a genocide, and we know that Hamas was created in 1988. If I do remember what year you mentioned. So from that, we can like see how there was at least what, 3 decades of just no Hamas, yet there's aggression against Palestinians, right? And there's massacres at Jenin, there's Gaza, there's a massacre in...
Lots of massacres, we don't have to debate that.
There's a lot of them, right, that's fair. So now, even after Hamas got created, there's a lot of just protesting, there's a lot of media, and there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of ways of peaceful resistance. There is a lot of, like we've tried here in the West, we tried back home, we tried in Palestine to just resist without having to use violence. But then everything did not work. That what you do when you there's nothing else to do, you resist with whatever you got. You say like what would you do? Isn't it dumb? Are they dumb for just attacking on October 7th because that would get their people killed? And if I remember correctly, you said that they martyred their tens of thousands.
I don't use that word. That was
that was the word they use to describe the people who've been killed by Israeli bombing.
Well, that doesn't mean that they killed them.
No, it means they're responsible indirectly for their deaths because what they did brought that
How am I
about.
responsible for my death if I am just resisting? If I'm just trying to liberate myself?
If you resist stupidly in a way that gets you killed, then you're responsible for your death.
How are we expected to resist?
Not stupidly. How do you do it in smart way?
That's impossible.
The argument that you're presenting the argument that you're presenting is like, I've been a socialist, I'm 75 years
We're
old.
not talking about socialism.
I've been a socialist my whole life. I didn't achieve socialism. So therefore, what I should do is drive a truck into the Pentagon and blow up the Pentagon so we can achieve socialism? What? There's no political logic to what you're saying.
Well, like people
You have a gun in your face?
You have to be able to win.
Exactly.
Are
Like
you
first of
being
all,
bombed?
Wait a second. If I could just we have to wrap this up. So the question is I hear is like, so if there's this pessimistic position of like, so what can be done? Like,
No.
isn't the violence justified? Because what else are you going to do?
no,
Well, sum it up
how else are
quickly.
you supposed to resist?
Good.
What
Thanks,
is
yeah.
the
I'd like to
way
respond.
resist? If there's a stupid way to resist. And the stupid way to resist is to just do whatever you can do, which is do it using violence, because there's nothing else is working at this point.
Okay.
There's nothing else working. Here's another thing.
Did the violence work?
Before you go to the next
Is
thing,
what we are seeing now working according to
I mean,
you?
there's a full group of people knowing about the subject. Maybe half of them did not know about the subject before that.
I'm sorry, I'm not on your side then. That's not left to me at all.
There's another point that you mentioned.
That's like throwing a tantrum.
can we respond to one of your questions first before you go to the next one? Okay, the one I want to respond to is what can be done.
Is there a way to?
Yep.
Yes, I want to respond to that.
Okay, do.
Okay, so one of the things that has happened that we have not really talked about today in the panel is the Israelis have skillfully used splits among the Palestinians, okay, to play off one faction against the other, right? And so you have a bloody business between Hamas and Fatah, right? And as a result, you have two impotent groups, right? One, Hamas, locked in Gaza, the other, right, the PLO or Fatah, locked in the West Bank. Divided, they cannot win. Divided, they cannot win. So that split has to be overcome. How that happens, I don't know, right? But right now, what you have in Hamas-ruled territory is a theocratic dictatorship, okay? And what we have in the West Bank territory is the dictatorship of an 88-year-old man, okay, who has been in power way too long. Right? So one way to resist more effectively is for the Palestinian forces to unite themselves. And that requires the people themselves to act.
And then what?
How?
Well, that's first you get there.
Just be respectful.
If they cannot even get to the West Bank, if they're not even allowed to cross Israel and go to the West Bank, how are they supposed to just conjoin for some reason? Also,
Sorry, I'm so sorry that we have one last question. We have to wrap up in 10 minutes, but hopefully this discussion can continue. We'd love to, if you'd like to submit a piece to the Platypus Review, the journal. We'd love to publish it. Let's talk later.
Okay, before I ask, I was just going to briefly say the military reality in Palestine, the closest remotely left-leaning solution is similar to that of the Viet Cong. Have they swooped in on paragliders, attacked a couple IDF bases and left, rescued a prisoner and left? They made one attack against the military target and left. The attack by the IDF on Gaza would not have been seen as justified by the international media, by the international governments. 10,000 citizens dead over a military target being attacked, that's not going to be a reasonable response. The only reason why the West even remotely tolerated the start of the attacks on Gaza was because of the extreme brutality of Hamas against civilian targets. That was a unbelievably stupid move on behalf of Hamas because it wasn't just violent resistance, it was violent resistance that actively weakened their cause internationally. Granted, it raised awareness. Granted, it returned some prisoners. Granted, it interrupted the Saudi deal. It did all of that at the expense of 12,000 human lives, most of the military infrastructure Hamas had, international reputation, etc. Not worth it. Failure. My question is, what is the day afterwards? What is tomorrow for Israel? What is happening with their government? What is their political reality a month after it's all over, a month after the real ceasefire? How do we speculate about this? How do we imagine a future where there's actually a liberal democracy, where there's actually a republic that's not ethno-nationalist? Computerism is done. The experiment of the extreme right wing is not tenable, it's not viable. Netanyahu is not in power, not supported past this point. But what happens next?
So up until your last sentence, you were totally correct.
Yeah. That's what I'm asking.
68% of the Israeli population, according to a poll before October 7th, considered itself right-wing. That number has gone up a lot since October 7th. So Netanyahu is toast. His political career is over. Everybody understands. He understands that. That's why he's trying to prolong the war. The person most likely to succeed him, well, Israel has a parliamentary system. So as long as they can win a vote of confidence, they have 3 more years in power. They probably won't last that long because there's lots of anger against the government and so on. So the government will probably fall sooner or later whenever the shooting stops, which they would like to prolong for as long as they can. And the most likely person to take Netanyahu's place would be Benny Gantz, who was in the opposition and who joined the war cabinet after October 7th. His political opinions are maybe that much to the center from Netanyahu. He's not a bully, he's not corrupt, so those things make Israelis happy. But no, you're going to get a government who's still committed to the de facto annexation of at least large parts of the West Bank, still committed to supporting the settlements, that will not perhaps be reliant on the quasi-fascist, messianist religious right, so a certain amount of craziness might be eliminated. But you're going to get a right-wing government that is going to be supported by whoever is the next president of the United States, which might be Trump if Biden keeps blowing things.
And will be supported by Biden and Congress.
Sure.
Regardless.
Yeah.
Supporting right now, like it doesn't matter who wins the presidency, Israel's politics is going to continue to be supported.
Yeah.
Maybe we can wrap up here with just some quick final remarks. I think the exchanges at the end sort of brought out, a real frustration with these politics. And the thing that I heard from you at the beginning was the pessimism, and sort of like the left project has completely, it has kind of expired itself. It's it may have had an aspiration for something, but now kind of like doesn't have a footprint anymore. And I just coming back to these questions of like, if there's no short-term project and it really requires a long-term project, what exactly do we learn from the history of the left on this conflict that should not be repeated? What should young people today trying to think about left politics to this not do?
But you can't ignore nationalism, neither can you submit to it.
I would like to say, at least here, I feel as if here in the United States, maybe a more integral role on educating should probably be taken, while also recognizing more nuanced positions, not taking the positions of more reactionary elements of either side of the conflict at their face value.
Bill? I think it's important for the American left to coalesce around two goals. One is to use whatever influence it has within the framework of the Democratic Party to push for things like a ceasefire, right? And to push the discussion as far as possible, at least, about moving politics of the region to the left. That is, to try to find some negotiating partners in the region that are not the current ones. Second point, I think, is important for the left, is to remember that very little actually happens in the legislature unless there are people in the street, right? So there has to be organizing done outside of the parliamentary arena to push for the things we want, like the ceasefire. And that's going on. That's something we can feel good about, okay? I think people have been going into the street and making a lot of racket. Some Democrats are starting to pay attention to that. Not enough, but that's where the effect is going to come.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Joshua, is the petition still at the back of the room?